Earlier today in Hiroshima, Japan, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky said that while it wasn't a fair comparison, images of the nuclear devastation in Hiroshima reminded him of what is happening in Bakhmut, the most hard-fought city in his own country. Yesterday, the leader of the Wagner Group, a mercenary force for Russia, announced that his fighters had taken Bakhmut. It is a claim that Zelensky and other Ukrainian officials deny. Zelensky was visiting Japan to take part in the G7 meeting of world leaders there. Joining me now to discuss Ukraine and the G7 and many other issues are Kori, Schake, a senior fellow and the director of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, and Gideon Rose, a distinguished fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and the former editor of Foreign Affairs. Welcome. You are both back from a trip to Kyiv, literally just back. Kori, what were your impressions? You got to meet a lot of people there.
Yeah, the grim commitment Ukrainians have to succeeding against the Russian invasion, they own it now in a way that even 6 months ago when I was last there, it felt more like they were persuading themselves they could withstand it. Now they know they can.
And Gideon, when you hear people say the Ukrainians need to understand they have to compromise. They're not going to be able to reclaim all their territory. We need to start some process of negotiation. What was your sense of how they view those arguments?
Every single person we talked to, from generals to soldiers, from cabinet ministers to local officials to civil society figures and ordinary citizens, was absolutely united. They see this as a fight for their lives. They say we're defending our homes and our children and our future, and we are going to reclaim all our territory. They didn't quite say with you or without you, but they suggested that the fight will continue until Ukraine is free. The only question is how long it will take and how much we have to suffer to get there.
And why do they think that, they'll be able to get everything, not just the 2022 lines, but the 2014 lines?
Yes. What was the most interesting thing was, as Kori said, in the fall you were there and you saw them almost trying to convince themselves, not false bravado, but bolstering their own confidence. Now the grim determination is met with a quiet confidence. They've taken everything the Russians have to throw at them. They've survived. They're now ready to punch back. And one general I talked to at one point said, and I asked him, where are we in the war? He said, we're towards the end of the first half. And they're going to go into the locker room knowing that they can beat the Russians. And the only question is what time scale and how long it's going to take and how much damage will be caused along the way.
Kori, what is their sense of what is going on the Russian side?
Well, as Gideon said, the Russian conduct of the war has meant that no Ukrainian government could possibly leave their people or their territory under Russian control. I heard several senior people in the Ukrainian government suggest that perhaps a leadership transition is already going on in Russia. And it's not that Vladimir Putin is permitting these lesser figures to bicker and fight and people are falling out of windows and generals being cashiered. It's that he no longer has the ability to control it.
That's fascinating. So when you see Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner forces, dissenting from the defense minister, this is something Putin has kind of lost control over.
Yeah, and we shouldn't avert our eyes from the fact that the next Russian government may actually be worse than the current Russian government.
Wow. Gideon, you have written a lot about how wars end. Do you think that the Ukrainian view of this is plausible, that they can actually win?
After this trip, I do. Wars end when either you have a durable stalemate that can't be moved or both sides come to understand that the trend is irreversibly in one direction. That's when the end game starts. We're not there yet. Each side is still trying to fight it out, and each side thinks that if the other gives up, if the West pulls back support, then maybe the tide will turn. So what's crucial now is to continue to pledge support for Ukraine so that the Russians realize that we're not going to back out. And with that, the Ukrainians need the tools to win, but they already know now that they can beat the Russians on the ground. And so the only question now is, when will the gap between the objective Russian situation and Russia's real perception of it change. And I think that'll happen this year. The war, I don't think the war will end this year, but I think as this year progresses, the gap between Russia's really bad situation and its public recognition of it will start to change.
Kori, what was your sense of how much the Ukrainians are worried that the West will, Western support will falter, will dry up, any of that?
I think they are worried, and justifiably worried, because the countries of the West are giving an enormous amount of assistance, especially the United States. But that's why President Zelensky's trips to the Arab League summit and the G7 and his trip around to European capitals mattered so much. It mattered for showing the breadth of Ukrainian support. It mattered for showing Russia's international isolation. And it mattered for gaining commitments of additional assistance to Ukraine, in particular the commitment of fighter aircraft whose radars and missiles can attack Russian forces from outside the response envelope.
So I got to ask you, because you are a Republican, do you worry that between Donald Trump and some of the things Governor DeSantis has said, some of the things that Josh Hawley and people like that have said, that there is substantial Republican opposition to supporting Ukraine with the kind of fullness that the Biden administration has done?
Yeah, I think there is opposition, but it really matters that the leadership, including Speaker McCarthy, are committed to continued assistance to Ukraine.
So you think that if Donald Trump goes on the campaign trail, becomes the nominee and says, as what he keeps saying, which I'm going to just stop the fighting, that you think Republicans in Congress will still vote for Ukrainian aid?
I do, because the United States isn't a shrewd strategic actor. A lot of times we're more a sentimental actor, and the war in Ukraine is such a battle of good against evil, and that Ukrainians are willing to restrict their military operations in their own territory and not extend it into the sanctuary of Russian territory really underscores who the good guys and the bad guys are. And I think Americans understand that, and that's why Republicans will continue to support aid to Ukraine. And in addition, even in shrewdly strategic terms, for 5% of US defense spending last year and 0 American military casualties, the Ukrainians are destroying the Russian army. And that is absolutely in America's interests.
Stay with us. Next up, President Biden was supposed to be headed to Papua New Guinea and Australia after the G7. Now he is back on his way to Washington, thanks to American political dysfunction. I'll discuss that with the panel and broader foreign policy in a moment. The Western Pacific. Instead, Air Force One took off 2 hours ago to take him back to Washington to deal with the debt ceiling crisis. Joining me again are Kori Schake of the American Enterprise Institute and Gideon Rose of the Council on Foreign Relations. Kori, again, Republican, what do you think of the debt ceiling crisis, and do you think it gets solved?
I am sympathetic to concerns by my fellow Republicans about the level of government spending, but threatening to default on the nation's debt is bad governance. The right way to rein in spending is through the practice of passing authorization and appropriation bills, not threatening to default.
Do you think that my fear is Kevin McCarthy's worry is he will not keep his job if he compromises.
That's certainly a possibility.
What did anyone talk about this in Ukraine, Gideon?
No, they did. They were concerned about their own future and less concerned about ours. I wish there was the same solidarity here that we saw in Ukraine across the different parties, across politicians who might run against each other. They were still all on board for the current effort, and one hopes that could be a lesson for us here.
Well, the stakes are sky high for them. Kori, you wrote a piece that I wanted to bring up, a foreign affairs article that was, I thought, the most intelligent kind of Republican critique of the Biden foreign policy. So just describe what is it that I know you support him on Ukraine, but more generally, what do you think Biden is getting wrong?
What he's getting wrong is he is such a protectionist that he cannot provide the vision for the U.S. and its allies to jointly reduce our reliance on China. You know, the strategy is to align American allies and pressure China into actually following the rules and becoming a responsible stakeholder. That's the strategic objective. But by so emphasizing democracy versus autocracy, it makes it more difficult for countries like Vietnam, whose assistance we want in this dispute, to take our side. And by pressing the military elements of it, they're overemphasizing the military elements of it because they can't deliver on the economic elements of it. I thought the G7 was a step in the right direction, though, and it appears to be where the Secretary of State's putting a lot of his diplomatic emphasis to align with allies and have a common approach to Chinese economic practices really is the center of gravity, and they took a small step in the G7 in the right direction.
But to be clear, what you're saying is that the protectionism is not directed just at China. It's a lot. I mean, you have Buy America provisions. What you're saying is, you know, you can't buy German stuff, you can't buy Canadian stuff, you can't buy.
Exactly. I mean, tariffs, economic tariffs on Canada are still in place. Europeans are complaining justifiably about the Buy America provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act, that the Biden administration has abandoned multilateral trade policies. And what countries want is market access and rules that benefit all of us, not just benefiting the United States. And the administration's answer has been, but you should want a strong American economy. And the response of others is, yeah, but not at the expense of our own success.
Now, when I read your article, I thought this is a very smart Republican critique. If only the leading Republicans running for president would agree with it. I mean, I suspect that Donald Trump is more protectionist than Biden.
Well, he's certainly as protectionist as Biden, and they're both mistaken, right? Expanding economic opportunity is what makes American power so cost-effective in the international order.
The irony is that Ukraine is providing the opportunity for a different model, because what the United States is doing in Ukraine is acting as team leader for the good guys. It is sourcing weapons and aid. It is coordinating European aid from a number of different countries to help Ukraine defend itself. It's not just a crisis and a danger, it's also an opportunity to show the kind of American leadership that will give the liberal international order a future as well as a past.
You told me something interesting. While you were there were a whole bunch of missile raids, on Kyiv. And you were told by the Ukrainians it might have been tied to the Chinese diplomatic initiative.
Yes, that the Russians and Chinese are coordinating operationally and diplomatically. And the suspicion in Kyiv is that the Russian missile strikes, the large missile strikes, Monday night in particular, were designed to prepare Ukrainians to accept compromises in their bargaining position to advance the Chinese initiative.
Did it work?
It backfired spectacularly because of the weapons the United States and the West have provided that help Ukraine shield their population from Russian attacks.
Because they intercepted every single one of those missiles, right?
Yes.
The Ukrainians are using American-made Patriot missiles to take down Russian-made hypersonic Kinzhal missiles in the best advertisement for American technology and American support you could get. Everybody watching this war will want the American weapons that are helping Ukraine win. So it's an opportunity to renew our defense industrial base and advertise that there's actually benefits to being on our side. And we saw that firsthand.
Do you think that the Chinese will play a role in finally resolving all this?
No, because they haven't yet acknowledged the war crimes the Russians are committing. They're not. The first element of the Chinese peace plan is respect for state sovereignty, and they can't yet acknowledge that Russia's in violation of that.
Kori, Schake, Gideon Rose, fascinating conversation. Welcome back. Glad you're here safe and sound. Next, I will talk to Pakistan's embattled former Prime Minister Imran Khan. They've tried to assassinate him. He's been arrested and released on corruption. He still fears for his life. Listen in.